The U.S. has called the killing of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani an act of self-defense. Iran responded by firing missiles at 2 Iraqi bases housing U.S. troops. Afterwards, Donald Trump claimed there were no casualties and announced his readiness to embrace peace with all who seek it. So, was the killing of Qasem Soleimani legal? And how can the current tensions be de-escalated? And what are the possibilities for a new Iranian nuclear deal? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Wang Jing, Associate Professor at Northwest University of China, and Richard White, security expert at the Wikistrat Global Consultancy. We also speak via satellite to Professor Sayed Mohammad Marandi, Dean of the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to start off on a legal perspective here. The United States said that Donald Trump did consult with his legal advisors before authorizing the operation killing Soleimani here, but we've heard criticism that it was entirely against international law, that international law and even U.S. law have been violated in that mission. Mr. Weiss, let me start with you. Your thoughts on the legality here?
Right. So I'm not a legal expert, but I do know that he had been put on the target list and had been on there for a while. So presumably to get on there, there had been some kind of legal review earlier on. But the basis for that decision, what goes into that, I don't know.
Mr. Wan, the killing happened on Iraqi soil without permission and consent from the Iraqi government. So when the United States said it was legal, what does it mean?
I don't think it's illegal. I think the United States' action, actually the killing of the Qasem Soleimani is 100% illegal. Although the United States defines Soleimani as some kind of terrorist, but it is the law of the kind of definition from the United States, not from the international society, not from the United Nations, not from Iraq, not from Iran. So if the United States is correct, okay, I define somebody as a terrorist, so I can kill him no matter where he is. So what about the other states? So Iran can define Donald Trump as a terrorist and kill him inside the United States. It's illegal. So I don't think the United States action of killing Soleimani is legal. I think it's 100% illegal.
Professor Marandi, let me bring you into this. Do you think the legality of the operation in the first place has been lost in the discussion in the aftermath?
Yes, I agree with your previous guess. It was obviously illegal. It was actually an act of war. It was an act of war not only against Iran, but it was also an act of war against Iraq, because the United States murdered a senior Iranian military official, and they also murdered a senior Iraqi military official, the deputy head of the Popular Mobilization Force. And these two gentlemen spearheaded the fight against ISIS, both in Iraq and, of course, General Soleimani in Syria as well. The Iraqi Prime Minister also, in his statement to Parliament, pointed out and revealed that Trump was not being honest about General Soleimani's trip to Iraq, which was an official trip. He was at the Baghdad International Airport when murdered. He was going to see the Iraqi Prime Minister, according to the Iraqi Prime Minister himself. The Iraqi Prime Minister said they were going to discuss a response to a Saudi letter to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister wanted to mediate. He said that Trump knew about this mediation effort and that Trump welcomed it. So it obviously had nothing to do with any imminent attack, and the United States is neither judge, jury, nor executioner. They are in Iraq. The United States is behaving not only against international law, but this act of war is in violation of their commitment to the Iraqi government, the Iraqi constitution, and the agreement that they have with Iraq. And this act has hurt the United States more than I think anyone in the Trump administration recognizes.
Let's talk about Soleimani for a while here. This was the commander, the Iranian commander in charge of the elite Quds forces. He was credited with choreographing Iran's defense policy in the region, forming and grooming military ties with others in the region. Mr. White, how big of a loss is the killing of Soleimani for Iran, which has swiftly, of course, named a replacement for the man.
Right. I think it would be a major impact because, as you said, for a while he had been in charge of coordinating and giving advice to a series of Iranian, pro-Iranian groups, military groups in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and so on. And he also had been given a bit of a cult of personality. Very much he was. You could see his photos, for example, on the streets of the besiegers of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. So it's true that there's a replacement now, but that person doesn't have the prestige, the apparently tactical skills of the previous commander. So I would think that would degrade Iran's foreign paramilitary operations for a while.
This was not just a senior commander, a general. He was also a very popular man. He was very big on social media. He was very revered back in Iran. Professor Wan, your take on how big a dent this was to Iran's defense policy, military ties with others?
I think it's very short, actually, the very big short for the for not only the United States public, but also, I mean, especially for the Iranian public, because Qasem Soleimani was so important, actually. He was the leader of the Al-Quds force of the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps. And we have to know that Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, actually, they are the very, very important foundation, the very, very core foundation of Islamic Iran's, I mean, the defense system. And inside this, Islamic Revolution Guards Corps, the Al-Quds force, they are in charge of everything, nearly everything. I mean, foreign places and the foreign operations outside Iran. So Soleimani is some guy who was in charge of something foreign operations, and he could be, considered as a very, very high level of the foreign policy decisions because his experiences. He is kind of roles in the Iranians' foreign operations. So he's very important. He could be perceived as a hero because he's fighting with IS in Iraq and Syria. He's fighting with Al-Qaeda for example, inside Afghanistan and also inside the border area with some other extremists that enemies of Iran. So he was a hero. So when the United States attacks someone like him, it's actually, as our Iranian guest, described that it's a war. It's actually an act of war. It's a major shock to the Iranian public. Okay, United States, what they want to, maybe they want war, so we should do something.
Professor Morandi, how is Tehran coping with the loss of Soleimani, and what kind of loss is that? Describe to us how big a loss is that to Iran?
Obviously, people are very angry and upset, and he was a very popular figure. He wasn't very high profile. He didn't make many speeches. He wasn't out in front of the camera all the time, but he was very well known, and since he would move along among soldiers, both Iraqi and Iranian and Lebanese and Syrian and Afghanis, and they would take selfies with him. His pictures were always available for people to see. People knew often where he was because of these selfies. So he was very popular among the ordinary soldiers. He'd often go to the front lines. But the Quds force is a part of the armed forces. It's a structure within the armed forces. And the #2 general in command has replaced him immediately. So I don't think it's going to have a significant impact on the way Iran pursues policy. In fact, I think, ironically, it's the opposite. It strengthens Iran because it has united the public. Between 5 to 7 million people participated in the funeral in Tehran alone. It shows the degree of legitimacy of the state and the anger of the Iranian population, despite the years of anti-Iranian rhetoric coming from the West. And also important, it shows that in Iraq how popular he was. For the last few months we've been seeing small protests against Iran in Iraq, which have been promoted by Western media, Saudi media, Emirati media. They were saying people hate Iran, they blame Iran, but when he was murdered along with his Iraqi counterpart, who was also a war hero, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. The funerals in Qasem and in Najaf and Karbala were huge. They were like Iran, and it showed that the degree of support that he had and the amount of popularity he had among Iraqis when they were carrying his body with an Iranian flag on top is extraordinarily high. And so not only does it turn the anger of Iranians and Iraqis against the United States, it unites Iranians and Iraqis because the blood of both Iranian commanders and Iraqi commanders were spilled together by the Americans at Baghdad International Airport, of all places.
But because of that massive and collective anger over the killing of Soleimani, do you think the Iranian people are satisfied in a way with how Iran has retaliated against the United States? Ballistic missiles launched targeting U.S. bases in Iraq, but according to President Trump, without causing any casualties there. What do you think, what is the Iranian reaction to that retribution?
Well, it was obvious that the Iranians were not targeting soldiers because they didn't strike the barracks. What the Iranians did was that they fired missiles towards the American base. All of the missiles went through without being intercepted, so the Americans were unable to shoot down a single missile, which was very impressive for Iranians. And the satellite photos show that all the missiles struck their targets. There were buildings that were destroyed, there were barracks, there were the areas where drones and helicopters and equipment were stored. They were also destroyed. None of the missiles missed their target from what we've seen in the satellite photos. So I think that's a strong message to the United States that all American bases in the region are vulnerable to Iranian missiles, and countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis that have been providing the Americans with military bases, the Iranians have warned them that if the Americans continue attacks against Iran, these countries will be deemed hostile. And since these missiles have been so effective, these countries now know that they are defenseless against Iranian missiles. So I think there will be added pressure in these countries to force or to push Trump away from continuing this escalation.
So we have satellite images, evidence on the ground there suggesting that Iran intentionally avoided causing American casualties with those ballistic missile attacks. Mr. Weiss, help us understand why Iran did that.
Right. So certainly we've seen evidence of the destruction on the ground, and we've also know there are no U.S. casualties. So it's certainly plausible that Iran deliberately tried to avoid killing Americans, and I think, or Iraqis at the base. So, and I think the reason is that provides a clear path to de-escalation. So we've had one U.S. attack on an Iranian target in Iraq, and now we've had one Iranian attack on a U.S. target in Iraq. And you could argue, well, we've reached a stable equilibrium. There was an opportunity for, I think President Trump could have chosen to attack the missile bases that had launched from Iran, but that would have been a clear escalatory step because it would have brought been an attack on the homeland, another country. So from looking at where you're going to have a logical fire break and escalation, that's one. We've had one exchange and it's been in a third country.
Professor Wang, your thoughts on this? So this has been a very measured, a very well thought after effort of retribution from Iran against the United States so as not to further push the United States over the edge of war. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, we have to know that every kind of retaliation, every kind of revenge, we need to have kind of the sword inside this kind of retaliation. What we want through this retaliation, what we want through this revenge, that we want more casualties of the other side, we want more killings, or maybe we want to show them that we are strong, that we are able to defeat you, but even that we don't want to. I think Iran adopted a very smart and a very rational manner that they show the United States they are capable of destroying the United States bases. They are capable of targeting United States military forces in the Middle East. But again, as Richard said, yes, it's correct that they show their rationality and they show their restraint. So that is why it makes the thing de-escalate. But I think in the future there was, of course, there will come kind of risks still remain. But according to this kind of round of retaliation and revenge, both Iran and the United States, they kept restraint, they kept rational, and this is very good starting of the escalation process.
The Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said in a tweet that Iran had concluded attacks on U.S. forces. Does that mean that Iran is standing down now, that this is the end of this latest episode of conflict, Professor Wang?
I think Iran shows their attitudes because the targeting of the killing of Soleimani erupted inside Iraq. And also Soleimani was a member of the general of the Al-Quds forces from the Iranian Revolution Guards Corps. So that is why Iran, this strike against United States targets was launched by the Iran Islamic Revolution Guards themselves. Because, our general was killed, so we retaliate. We launched the missiles. And also, this is why the targets of the United States military bases inside Iraq was targeted, not the United States bases in Saudi Arabia, not the United States military bases in Qatar, but only United States military bases inside Iraq was targeted by Iran. So Iran showed their kind of rationality as a threat, but Iran also showed that we are capable of doing this, but we choose the other very rational, very restrained manner.
Mr. Weitz, for the time being, is it over? Is the killing, is the death of Soleimani behind the two countries as they think of ways on how to move forward from this point?
I would say yes and no. So yes, it looks like in the current exchange ended. As I said, President Trump declined to retaliate for the missile launch, and there's been no further Iranian use of force against the U.S. forces anywhere. But no, I think this recent exchange has brought the relationship to a less, even lower point than it was before. And so I am not optimistic that we'll see, for example, a new nuclear deal, which is what President called for in his President Trump called for in his presentation after explaining why he didn't respond with force to the Iranian ballistic missile strike. And I think it's going to make any resolution of U.S.-Iranian tensions more difficult for a while.
Here's how President wants to proceed from this low point, as you pointed out. We heard from President Trump that he's ready to impose more economic sanctions on Iran, but he's also said that the United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. And on top of that, we heard from the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Kelly Craft, saying that the U.S. is ready to engage without preconditions in serious negotiations with Iran. What is this? We have the threat of sanctions and we have an olive branch.
So this is a not unusual approach to negotiation. It's this dual-track policy of responding with pressure to give you leverage, but then also offering to negotiate. This is how the U.S. has been responding for a range of issues involving, for example, Russia on arms control violations. And so I think that the idea is you show the Iranians they would be better off entering into negotiations than not. And it seems to me it's a logical strategy.
Will the Iranians hear that message? Are they more likely to come back to the negotiating table? Because the U.S. has been ratcheting up sanctions on Iran since last year. If we're talking about crippling the Iranian economy, these sanctions may have done their part in that. But if we're talking about getting Iranians around, getting them to come back to the negotiating table, will sanctions work? Professor Wang.
Sanctions will not work. At least not very recently, because this is a very typical Donald Trump strategy of the diplomatic strategy, not only against Iran but also against Russia and against everyone. Because on the one hand, Donald Trump wants to impose a lot of pressures against his very target opponent or his target the partners, the negotiated partners. But on the other hand, his final goal, his final aim was to bring him back to the table and reach the kind of the deals that would constrain the other one's interest and benefit favor United States' own interest. So that is kind of strategy. On the one hand, impose some kind of sanctions and bring more and more pressure to make you make concessions on the negotiation table. But on the other hand, the precondition, over the Iranian issue is that you have to make them come to talk. If nobody talks, only sanctions, only pressures, that lead to nothing. It's kind of the total joke, inside the United States strategy in the Middle East, because nobody comes to talk, so why you impose sanctions for? So this is something I think that Donald Trump did that is why we explained that last year Donald Trump repeated many times that, okay, we want to talk with the Iranian president, we want to talk with Iranian foreign ministers, you can come to the White House directly, but nobody will go because United States make the mistake, because United States withdraw from the JCPOA or the Iranian nuclear deal, and now United States killed the Soleimani. Nobody hoped to talk with the United States partners. Nobody would like to talk with Donald Trump himself. So this is a very funny thing. On the one hand, if you want to really talk to them, you should show your willingness. You should show your desire, not to show only the pressure, not to show only threat.
Professor Morandi, so we have a sustained pressure campaign from the United States on Iran, but we also have this invite where the United States is ready to engage in serious negotiations without preconditions. Iran wasn't willing to come to the negotiating table and talk with the United States even before this latest episode happened. Will it be willing to talk now?
Well, it's the United States that left the negotiating table. Iran and the P5+1 engaged in negotiations for years until they reached a nuclear deal. It's the Americans that tore the deal, left the table, and started bullying other countries to ignore the deal. So as long as the United States is not abiding by its commitments and it's trying to force other countries to do the same, there's nothing to talk about. Whenever the Americans decide to come back to the negotiating table and abide by their commitments, then we can start talking with the Americans. Otherwise, who's to say that the United States in future won't tear up future commitments? And by murdering people and carrying out acts of war, they're not going to get anywhere. They're just going to push Iran in the opposite direction. And I think the most important thing that the Americans are forgetting here is the amount of outrage that they've created in Iraq. They can feel good about a few hundred protesters on the streets that are often pro-Ba'athist, pro-Saddam Hussein people, or supporters of ISIS, or people linked to American NGOs. They can go on the streets and protest against Iran. But we saw the huge numbers of people who were protesting against the United States and who were taking part in the funeral processions. So the Americans have outraged Iraqis. The Iraqi parliament has demanded the United States leave. The Iraqi armed forces want the Americans to leave. If the Americans don't leave, then I think it's going to get very dangerous in Iraq.
It's very safe to say that under President Donald Trump, the Americans will not come back to the JCPOA. Donald Trump wants a new deal there and wants to engage other signatories of the deal in joining the United States in pushing Iran for a new deal. What will now happen to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal? Because Iran has also said that it will no longer stay committed to any restrictions set out in that deal. Professor Morandi.
Yes, Iran, because of U.S. behavior, has done this. The Iranians, for a year and a half, they remained fully committed to the deal, even after the Americans left, because they wanted to show the international community that the United States is the problem. Just like now in this assassination, an act of war that the Americans carried out in Baghdad. The Iranians, through a very careful and measured response, again, they wanted to show the international community that it was Trump who's the problem. But now the Iranians have gradually decreased their commitments to put pressure on the Europeans to start abiding by their commitments. And Iran no longer has any restrictions except for the fact that the International Atomic Energy Agency still has a very large amount of oversight. They have access to all elements of the Iranian nuclear program in accordance with the nuclear deal, and their access in Iran is greater than in any other country. But if the Europeans don't start changing their policy and abiding by their commitments, then I think the Iranians will gradually decrease the International Atomic Energy Agency's ability to monitor the Iranian nuclear program.
Mr. Weitz, your take on what will happen to that original deal?
Right. Well, that's not going to come back. I mean, so President Trump has ruled it out. I think the Democrats, some of them said, the Democrats who are running for president, some of them said they were elected, they would return. But you know, some of the provisions are already going to expire. Like this year, the ban on weapons purchases by Iran will expire. So I would think that even if a Democrat is elected who wants to have a return to the deal, and the Iranian government want to do that, they'd still have to modify it a bit. So I think we'll have to have a new deal at some point that could either be very closely modeled after JCPOA with some of the extensions and provisions upgraded for what's happened in the last few years, or if President Trump is reelected, it would probably have to have greater changes.
The remaining signatories on the deal are still interested in keeping that deal alive. Professor Wang, your thoughts on what will happen to that deal?
That deal is now in the very important period, because on the one hand, actually, Iran has already tried to show that they want to withdraw from the commitments, most of the commitments to the deal. But on the other hand, the IAEA, the very, very important watchdog of the international society over the monitoring of the Iranian nuclear capability development process, still there, still inside Iran. Iran still hopes them and permit them to monitor all kinds of the research and development process. So that shows that if the states really want to develop the kind of nuclear bomb, nobody wants IAEA will be there. So they still keep IAEA there, so that is why Iran wants to show this to the international society that, okay, we have the willingness. We still have the willingness, we still want to keep peace and with the international society. We still want to be a very, very important friend to the international society, and we still want to develop very peaceful, nuclear technology, not the wartime technology. So that is why I think it's important.
Yes, please.
Yeah, just to add on that, the thing is, though, that the IAEA inspections, while important, were really not that's not the Iran nuclear deal, right? The Iran nuclear deal was specifically to limit the amount of fissile material Iran had in terms of quality and quantity. So if the inspections continue, that's good, but that in itself, it's not the Iran nuclear deal. It's how the IAEA deals with most countries. And there's a difference between the IAEA inspections of declared nuclear sites.
May I add one point?
And those that, for example, would come if there are additional inspections of undeclared but suspected nuclear sites. And that's still, that's not clear. So it's good that Iran would show its declared sites, but that's not the nuclear deal. We'd have to have something else on to return to the nuclear deal.
Professor Morandi, we have about 20 seconds there. I knew you wanted to add a point.
Yes, I was just going to say Iran will not accept any changes to the nuclear deal. And in fact, now that Iran is pushing forward with research and development without the restrictions before, this nuclear deal really doesn't make that much sense in certain ways, because Iran has progressed forward thanks to Trump's policies. But in any case, if the United States wishes to come back to the deal, we will have the same deal. But if the Americans want
I'm sorry
more,
to interrupt you. We're running out of time on this broadcast. Professor Morandi joining us there from Tehran, and Mr. Weitz and Professor Wang here in our Beijing studio. Thank you so much. This is still a very active situation. We should all be watching closely. And thank you for staying with us on Dialogue. I'm Zhongshi in Beijing.